The era of Resident Evil that Capcom wants you to forget. I'm sure you probably saw that title and thought I'm being sensational or even clickbaity, but believe it or not, that's not the case. You see, I was just getting back on a Resident Evil kick, which is never too far from the surface because I find most of the series is easy to pick up and play, and during that time some news pieces came out. For context, Good Old Games, a digital PC storefront secondary to Steam that specializes in preserving lesser-known PC games, were able to get the license to release the original PC versions of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 back in 2024. But as it turns out, it was a little bit more of a fight than they anticipated. Good Old Games senior business and development manager, whose name I won't even begin to try to pronounce, released a statement saying that Capcom executives were apparently bewildered that anybody would actually want to try and play the original versions of those games when the remakes are available. It was apparently difficult to convince them to give the license as a result, and that struck me as frustrating because I personally believe that a remake does not inherently replace the original version of a game. And I would say most people who play games are on the same page as me, but the problem is executives don't have that opinion. There are a lot of instances where high-ranking executives in various companies don't understand how there could be any fondness for anything not up to current release standards. I remember former PlayStation executive Jim Ryan saying something to that effect during the heyday of the PS4. But either way, Capcom clearly has a backwards attitude about their own back catalog of Resident Evil, and this attitude towards the original run of Resident Evil games was confirmed for me when I saw this graphic. Do you notice something here? It's not Resident Evil 2 2019, Resident Evil 3 2020, or Resident Evil 4 2023, it's RE2 1998, RE3 1999, and RE4 2005, which is completely backwards compared to what it normally should be. It's the original, and then the remake has the brackets with the year. But by doing this the other way around, it's a tacit admission that they consider the new versions of these games the only versions worth owning and the true definitive experiences. And that's why to me it comes across as though this era of Resident Evil is the one they want you to forget about in favor of the new era. This attitude of believing that the original versions of games can simply be replaced is exactly why we need to keep these versions in our hearts and minds. Discuss them as what they are, the original versions, and not what they want you to think they are, some forgettable versions that don't have any significance. This is about history, so in the spirit of preserving games that the executives want you to forget, and in the spirit of my suddenly reinvigorated interest in Resident Evil, I decided I would do a retrospective on the original Resident Evil trilogy, 1, 2, and Nemesis, which I will just be referring to as 3. But before I do, I just wanted to say a big thank you to this video's sponsor, Manta Sleep. I'm actually a customer of Manta Sleep because they do sleep masks better than any other company I've ever bought from. Their sleep masks are designed with detachable cups that fit around the eyes to block out all light while still being comfortable even while sleeping on your side, as well as an adjustable strap to give you a nice snug fit to your preference so you don't find it halfway down your face in the middle of the night. But the padded strap is also comfortable for sleep in pretty much any position. Manta Sleep has a range of sleep masks depending on your sleep preferences, including a weighted mask, a mask with cooling eye cups, and even a mask with built-in Bluetooth headphones, so if you're like me and you like to fall asleep while listening to your favorite podcasts, you can do that without the awkwardness of wearing headphones in bed. Each of these masks are comfortable and high quality, and right now, if you buy from my affiliate link on this video, you'll get a special 10% discount. Just scroll down and click on the tagged product and you get 10% off. It's that simple. Optionally, you can also go to their website and use the code BACON at checkout for the same 10% discount. That's mantasleep.com with the code BACON at checkout. Thank you to Manta Sleep once again for sponsoring today's video. The original Resident Evil needs no introduction, however I will introduce it. It wasn't the first survival horror game, far from it. It wasn't even the first fixed camera survival horror game with pre-rendered backgrounds. However, it might as well have been these things considering it was easily the first survival horror game to be a mainstream hit, selling over 5 million copies. It was also an extremely early PS1 game, arguably the first major hit from the console's history. It was released so early it came out in the long box format, which I own. It was a gift from one of my subscribers. I'd show you, but it's it's not so simple right now. Of course, the game did come out on multiple platforms, but most people only know it for the PS1 version, as the PlayStation was king shit of that entire generation. So that's the version I'll be playing, particularly the director's cut, not the DualShock version, though I'd rather not have the atmosphere ruined by clowns farting through vuvuzelas. Now, the original Resident Evil is one of the most perplexingly great games on the PS1. I say it's perplexing because it's one of those games that really shouldn't work when you look at it from a broad point of view. The combat is basic, the presentation is laughable at times, the controls are jank. It shouldn't be a good game, and yet it's this series of intangible elements that comes together to not just be something that works, but something that's great. Granted, there's probably people out there less forgiving than I who couldn't get past the more primitive elements, but that's fine. Still, I enjoy it nonetheless. The plot of this game is well known, perhaps even iconic. In the outskirts of a fictional city called Raccoon City, a special forces unit of the RPD, the STARS Alpha team, has to investigate a series of mysterious events. There's rumors of strange creatures mauling people to death, and even their secondary unit, the Bravo team, went in to investigate first and have since lost contact. So something fishy is going on. Well, anyways, upon arriving, the team is attacked by savage, seemingly indestructible dogs. They even maul one of the members, Joseph, meaning the team is forced to retreat to a nearby estate, the Spencer Mansion. This is where the game branches off into one of two directions depending on who you choose to play as. If you choose to play as Jill, you and Barry are then stuck in the mansion alone while Chris and the team leader, Albert Wesker, mysteriously vanish. However, if you play as Chris, you find yourself alone until you stumble across the only known surviving member of the Bravo team, Rebecca Chambers, who apparently is only 18. My headcanon is that she was either a Nepo hire that was put into a high-ranking position under the assumption that the Bravo team doesn't actually do anything. Either that, or she's the team mascot. Yes, I know she was a child prodigy, I'm just having fun. From here, both plot lines basically take the same path. You find yourself exploring the mansion to try and find any survivors, and there's this grand unfolding mystery about the nature of the attacks and the nature of the mansion. It becomes clear that there's some conspiracy going on as you discover more and more horrific monsters throughout the facility, as well as read their memoirs. Itchy Tasty, one of the best things they ever wrote. But for what it's worth, the plot is that the Umbrella Corporation, a pharmaceutical company, was developing a bioweapon called the T-Virus, or Tyrant Virus, in an underground lab of the Spencer Mansion. But due to several factors, the T-Virus was released and infected all the facility staff, meaning that every enemy in the game is either a former member of staff or an animal that they were doing experiments on. Meanwhile, Albert Wesker, who's on the payroll of Umbrella and is the leader of the STARS Alpha team, lured them all into the mansion to serve as a field test for the capabilities of these bioweapons, so Umbrella could use the data to refine the process. Whether or not they survived was kind of irrelevant, which doesn't explain why he captures one of the team and puts them into a jail cell where they're not under attack by any enemies. Now, of course, the plotline in this game is about as cornball as it gets. All the characters are these stock action heroes. Albert Wesker couldn't be a more obvious villain without tattooing the word antagonist onto his forehead. And you don't need me to tell you the acting is legendarily awful. Possibly the worst acting you will ever see in anything, much less a game.
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things.
Wow, what a mansion!
I just joined the STARS Bravo team last month. Well, I'm really sorry. Are you all right?
It almost feels like they got people off the street to act in the game. I heard that apparently a couple of the actors were tracked down and some of them even embraced the legendary nature of their performances, but others didn't. In particular, the actress for Jill apparently doesn't care to be involved. From what I understand, the reason why the performances are the way they are is because the voice director didn't actually speak much English and just decided to direct them to speak in a way that sounded cool to him, and as a result, it sounds cool to a Japanese person, but to us it sounds absolutely absurd. Kinda makes you wonder how good the voice acting in a lot of anime actually is. But still, it gives the game a legendary cheesiness that is completely impossible to recreate because it's not something you can make on purpose. It's funny though, because you can tell the plot is sort of an afterthought given how generic it is in a lot of ways. Meanwhile, there is so much thought put into all other aspects of the game, because in many ways the game design is impeccable. Everything builds into the horror and the atmosphere of the situation, because the essence of horror in a game is to make you feel at a perpetual disadvantage. Even in more action-focused horror games like Resident Evil 4, where you have plenty of ammo and plenty of weapons, the enemy numbers are so relentless that you can't help but feel overwhelmed. And in this case, they manage to make you feel at a disadvantage in a great many ways. First of all, with a limited inventory. As Chris, you have 6 slots, and as Jill, you have 8, which means you have to ration healing items, weapons, and puzzle items, and you have to constantly keep in mind where the safe rooms are in order to exchange your items depending on a number of factors, including the difficulty of enemies around you, which doors you need to unlock, or puzzles you need to solve nearby. Thankfully, all the storage trunks have a universal inventory, so you don't need to go from safe room to safe room looking for whatever it is you need. It doesn't make much sense in context, but it's a bit of mercy that would have otherwise made the game beyond obnoxious. Though with Chris, inventory management is a bit annoying obviously, because you only have 6 items, which means you never have enough of anything. My strategy was to leave behind healing items and only heal in safe rooms. Of course, what's horror without risk, and so inventory isn't the only thing they limit. They also limit your ability to save. You can only save if you have an ink ribbon, and if you run out, tough. You better hope to survive until the next time you find ink, or you need to play flawlessly. And when you're trying to conserve your saves, this can get extremely hairy the longer you go. Because the longer you go, the more you risk having to redo. Granted, in pretty much every modern release, there is some way to rewind progress or save state, so this is an aspect of the game that really only applies if you're going out of your way to play the game authentically. But if you are, the threat of losing progress can make some of those enemy encounters terrifying, especially because you never seemingly have enough ammo, so you can't afford to kill every zombie, because even the base level zombies can sometimes take upwards of 10 bullets or so before going down, and they have a habit of getting up once or twice after going down, so you need to pay attention to whether or not there's a pool of blood under them, because that's the universal indicator of them being dead. Even still, it may seem like the game gives you a lot of ammo, but it's never enough, and sometimes I find myself having to manipulate the zombies' pathfinding so I can skirt around them, which doesn't always work, and that also plays into the risk, because playing conservatively like this can sometimes make things worse if they catch you and damage you, especially because some zombies can turn on a dime if they're near you. That's just unfair. And of course, the final thing that really sells this game as a horror experience is the fixed camera that constantly jumps from angle to angle. This was done to conserve the PS1's memory, obviously, but it uses this limitation and turns it into a strength, because it relinquishes control from you, and therefore it adds a layer to the mystery, because sometimes you need to get yourself into the right position to be able to see what's nearby. And sometimes you may end up fighting things completely out of your view. Sometimes you may also be taken by surprise from things that were previously out of your view. It adds a layer of helplessness to the game, which I can dig like a shallow grave. Even the combat can be quite harrowing because of how much of a disadvantage you have. This game has tank controls, meaning that regardless of what angle the camera's in, left and right turn your body and up makes you walk forward. Kind of a necessary thing with the camera, because otherwise you'd be constantly changing direction as the camera itself changes position. But because of this, your movement is also somewhat limited, and as far as combat is concerned, you can't move while you're aiming. So a lot of it is about getting into the best spot, aiming at whatever is attacking you, and just shooting until it dies. And if the enemy is faster than your ability to shoot them dead, you better hope you can run away quick enough, or you're just gonna take damage. It's also what makes the boss fights so terrifying at times as well. Some of these bosses move quicker than you, and trying to line them up to shoot them while not leaving yourself open is not an easy task, especially if you're playing a version of this game without auto-aim. Granted, as you become more familiar with the layout of the areas around you, you start to become more confident in your ability to discern who's worth killing and who's worth leaving alive. Like, for example, there's this one hallway at the bottom corner of the mansion that's a double wide hallway with like 3 zombies, and so it's very easy to weave around them, even with the camera angle, and while the zombies can be a bit tough at first, they're not particularly difficult once you figure out their AI. But one thing this game is really good at is steady evolution. The first instance of this is fairly early on, where you have to run through this one conspicuously quiet hallway. Dogs are about as tough as the regular enemies, but are much faster, so it's easy to get blindsided if you're unprepared. And that's just the start. This game isn't very long, and they do a good job at making sure to keep things fresh whenever the game is in danger of becoming stale, including giant spiders, which scared the crap out of me the first time I played this game. And most notably, the Hunters. These gremlin-looking creatures that kinda reminds me of these enemies from the Jacques level in the first Spyro game. They're significantly tougher, quicker, harder to kill, and deal way more damage than the average enemy. Although they are quite polite, savagely running up to the house and then politely opening the door in the proper way. It's honestly hilarious. There's a reason why the initial cutscene of the zombie turning around is the only one that stands the test of time, because it's the only one to adequately communicate the threat in a non-comedic way. The hunter is funny, of course, but big shout out to these mutant sharks who get this grand entrance only for you to immediately drain the water and kill the threat entirely. That is so funny. The way the game constantly evolves, I feel like it's one of the primary appeals of the game. A sense of unfolding mystery and a constant forward march of progress with new ideas that makes exploration rewarding and ensures that boredom is impossible. You're never quite sure what's going to happen every time you open a new door, but you can be sure that it's probably going to try and kill you. Part of that flow has to do with the primary location of the game, Spencer Mansion. I'd almost go as far as to say that Spencer Mansion is one of the most elegantly designed levels in the history of gaming. The way it sprawls out and interconnects back into itself with the central room as the main hub is almost the same level as something like Pandora's Temple in God of War. It's big, but it's still easy to navigate. Every room is distinct and memorable, meaning it's very easy to remember where specific things go and what to do with them, such as the dropping of a statue off one level and having to go down to the bottom level. It does mean you have to navigate the level design in a more thoughtful way, and every time you do, you have to risk life and limb by going through other areas which may or may not still have enemies. So it's almost like you have to plan specific routes around the mansion that you know are safe in order to protect yourself from having to go through another couple of enemies and potentially get damaged, or otherwise having to waste ammo. When the hunters showed up, I knew I didn't have enough shotgun ammo to kill all of them, so I had to run around the mansion in an incredibly arcane way just to make sure I didn't have to face any more than I needed, which all comes back to that unique resource management aspect the game emphasized. It all connects to create something far better than the sum of its parts. The disadvantageous combat, the exploration, the puzzles, the reshuffling of the deck as far as enemies and enemy layout. It all goes to make an engaging experience that never gets boring. Is it scary though? It was at one point, but I feel like you kinda get used to it after a short while, and it doesn't take that long for even the scariest of threats to just be a bump in the road. I mean, the atmosphere is great though. The minimalist music, the bright cheery visuals that juxtapose against the horrors we're seeing, the eerie stillness, and the great sound design from various monsters that when mixed with the fixed camera means that the anticipation of finding a monster you can hear but can't see really gives this game a feeling of isolation and hopelessness, which creates tension that can simply eat away at you. So that even when it's not scary, it can at least keep you on your toes, and when mixed with the aforementioned visual style of the mansion itself, it gives the entire experience an undercurrent of wrongness, so it hits every note except for being scary in the long term. It's certainly tense, and potentially losing progress through poor resource management and taking too much damage certainly sucks, but I haven't really been scared by this game in a number of years. But still, tension is enough, and the way it turns its shortcomings into strengths to build the tension is genius. Granted, not everything about it is a strength. Of course, there is the point about Jill's playthrough being significantly easier than Chris's playthrough because she gets more weapons, fewer enemies, the ability to unlock a bunch of things that would otherwise need keys, and a sidekick who does half the work for you. I already talked about this in a different video, but the summary is, it almost feels like this is a non-standard difficulty option that existed before the game actually had difficulty options in later releases, but even before difficulty options were implemented, it made Chris feel more obnoxious to play as. And as such, for a first-time player, you'll definitely get more enjoyment out of playing as Jill because she is simply a more convenient character to play as. Chris does have a few advantages, particularly having more health, and even with the disadvantages, it's still perfectly manageable, but personally, the only times I played as Chris, well, I only did so to say I did. And the puzzles are a bit meh. The majority of them are just about putting whatever weird-shaped key into whatever weird-shaped lock. It's just a matter of having the right items. The most complex they get is having to push blocks that weigh down switches. I think there's one example where you have to use a winch to push something out from a wall so you can push it in the right direction, but that's just a combination of pushing puzzles and having the right items. The single puzzle I actually felt required some thought was when you have to translate a bunch of symbols in order to get a computer password, which was actually pretty clever, and I think the puzzle aspect would have been a lot better if they were all on that level. None of this means the puzzles are bad, just a bit mediocre. They're a means to an end. Then also, whenever the game gets out of the Spencer Mansion, I feel like it does take a noticeable dip in quality. I think that's mostly down to the other areas not having the same elegance of design that the mansion does. The catacombs, for example, are like 5 rooms total. Even the underground lab, which is probably the second best level in the game, doesn't have much going for it in spite of introducing several new enemies. Also, while the other bosses can be distinctly tough, the final boss is kind of hilarious. Though that's partially my fault. I like to conserve my best ammo, so I basically saved all my magnum ammo for the final boss, only to find out that on normal mode he goes down in 4 shots. That is hilarious. This is your ultimate weapon? What a punk. Even Chris agrees.
Chris? Stop it.
Wesker, you're pitiful. This is your savior? You say this failure is your savior?
It's true, but he shouldn't say it.
Granted, even by itself, it's not exactly a hard boss considering he just walks around slowly. You practically have to go out of your way to be hit by this one. Personally, if this were about collecting data on the T-Virus, my first note would be, next time maybe have a monster without a herniated heart on its chest. Kinda defeats the purpose of a super weapon when its most important organ is a giant glowing weak spot. However, the twist about him showing up on the roof, if you get the criteria for either good ending, is pretty cool, and what's funny is, in these early games, you have to have a specific amount of inventory slots free to use the final weapon on the final boss. So they have to contrive a way for you to use an item right before entering the final area. In this case, a battery that's conspicuously out of its slot, and it's about 6 feet away. But either way, you throw up a flare, you survive a minute or 2 against the tyrant, you get a rocket launcher, and I swear, every time I get to this point, I always instinctually say, "Smile, you son of a," before firing. And that's that. The mansion blows up, along with any evidence of Umbrella's wrongdoing, something that Chris even encouraged.
Rebecca, can you do it?
Yes, sir. I'll set off a triggering system for a bomb.
Okay, now we have a chance to escape.
And they get away with dawn dawning. And that was the original Resident Evil, a survival horror classic, and one of the best of its kind. It definitely suffers in a few areas, such as the level design in some of the later areas as well as general jank, but damned if it doesn't come together to make something that's weirdly absorbing. This is a game I could come back to anytime, and that also goes for its sequel, Resident Evil 2. Released 2 years later in 1998 on PlayStation and 1999 on Windows and even N64. Not the Saturn though, I guess this was after the entire industry including Sega had already given up on it. The N64 version is notable because while the PS1 version came on 2 discs due to a miscalculation of file size when compressing the audio files, somehow the team at Angel Studios managed to port the game onto the 64 megabyte limit of an N64 cartridge. And they barely sacrificed anything. I don't know what black magic they worked here, but that's pretty sick. The company would then go on to become Rockstar Games San Diego and made some Midnight Club games and were the sole developers of Red Dead Redemption as well as the Undead Nightmare expansion pack.
Based.
I think Resident Evil 2 is in some ways a step back, but in many ways is an improvement. This game takes place approximately 2 months after the events of the first game. The remaining members of STARS thought the nightmare was over once they blew the mansion up along with any remnants of the experiments. However, as it turns out, Umbrella had multiple labs working on bioweapons, in one of which a scientist named William Birkin was working. The military came to seize his work, and he deliberately injected himself with something new called G-Virus to protect himself. In the ensuing attempts to neutralize him, a bunch of T-Virus was released, which infected some rats and subsequently the water supply of the city. And from there, it was only a matter of time before the entire city was taken over by the undead. I'm wondering if this was a deliberate attempt to invoke the parallels with the Black Death, which also notably spread because of rats, and also destroyed entire towns the moment someone found themselves infected. Well anyways, in those 2 months, Chris Redfield has gone missing, which set the pattern of Chris Redfield going missing pretty much whenever he's not on screen. And whenever he's not on screen, everybody's saying, "Where's Chris Redfield?" Such as his sister Claire, who set off for Raccoon City to try and find out where he went. At the same time, a rookie police officer named Leon S. Kennedy is driving to the precinct for his first day on the job. Unfortunately, he's late on account of being hungover. From what I understand, it's because apparently the night before he got dumped by his girlfriend. So that's the gist. These two people whose stories couldn't be more different converging at the Raccoon City Police Department. Much like last time though, the story centers around an ever-evolving mystery about the nature of the outbreak and the people involved. There's two separate paths you can take, but each results in a second roughly parallel story with the other character. The story of Leon features a support character named Ada Wong, a mysterious femme fatale whose secrecy and morally dubious nature is a major part of the story's evolution. And Claire's story features a support character named Sherry Birkin, child of the scientist who started this mess, whom Claire becomes a pseudo-big sister figure to, protecting her from all the horrors of the situation. They claim that Sherry is 12, but she looks and acts maybe 6 years old.
My mom called and told me to go to the police station because it was too dangerous to stay at home.
I feel like the increased scope really benefits the story, as it takes what was once a small, very centralized conflict and brings it to a level where even the people who weren't involved are now forced into the conflict. It feels more epic in that sense, but it also feels like the more impersonal elements of the story could be a bit of a step back depending on your perspective. The main characters of this story feel comparatively incidental to the conflict. Even Chris Redfield going missing feels somewhat incidental. It works in a sense that they're strangers to the situation and discovering everything alongside you, so their reactions will generally match yours, but it also means it's easy to question their motivations. If I were Leon driving to work late on my first day and I see the city that I'm being assigned to is being overrun by zombies, I am turning on my heel and going the other way. Claire, I understand to a point. She's going to the precinct because that's where her brother most recently worked. And the precinct is coincidentally connected to the various networks of passages that lead to an underground lab. But once she finds out that Chris isn't there, and once she finds the note indicating that he's in Europe, what reason does she have to stick around and not make a break for it? Incidentally, I find it funny that Chris encouraged Rebecca to blow the mansion up in the previous game, but in the files, he laments the fact that the mansion is gone, and so any trace of evidence against Umbrella is also gone. I imagine he probably just wanted to see a cool explosion and didn't think about the consequences until after. None of this is to say that either of them being outsiders to the situation is a plot hole or anything, because I can only speak through my own perspective and my mentality doesn't necessarily line up with theirs. I would have ran, but I'm also a coward. It's all just down to how you interpret it, and really a lot of this is only potentially an issue if you think about it too much. Still, the grand unfolding mystery is compelling and works hand in hand with the ever-evolving nature of the horrors of the situation. Plus, it helps that the presentation is a big step up. It's still not up to the modern standards of voice acting, but it is leagues ahead of where it was.
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down! We can't stay out here. Head to the police station. It'll be a lot safer.
It's still very cheesy, but it's cheesy more in a campy B-movie sort of way as opposed to a budget porno way. And it lends the game a lot of charm. I mean, come on. This game ends in one case with a determined statement followed by cheesy butt rock.
Hey, it's up to us to take out Umbrella.
Something that is such a cliche, it comes back around to being awesome. So they were clearly having fun with this one, and I approve. But I also can't tell if this is attempting to be a slight parody of cheesy action films or if it's attempting to be one, because when you're in the game, everything is treated with the utmost seriousness. When you're running through the streets or running through the infested hallways, there's nothing to laugh at, and I would say the horror elements are arguably even better presented than the first game. Like, for example, the first game starts off very gradually, subtly building into the encounter with the first zombie, but in an attempt to really showcase how things have escalated, this time you are thrust right into a horde as the game begins. And you have to desperately run away to survive, as you don't even have close to the amount of firepower to survive the horde through brute force. It's not until you get to the police station that things slow down and you're able to take things in. It's an extremely effective intro that puts you right on the edge from the beginning. And once you're in the RPD precinct, you find yourself in another situation like Spencer Mansion. One could ask why the layout is so weird and why a police precinct has such arcane locks and whatnot. The official explanation is that the building used to be a museum which was retrofitted into being a police precinct, but I don't know, I'm not sure if that passes the sniff test. Even in a museum, I doubt there would be a fountain where you have to put a medallion which then drops a key to unlock one of the rooms. That's ridiculous even for the most dataist of architects. Then again, I am fully aware that the Resident Evil 2 that exists was a second bite of the apple, so to speak. The original version of this game was apparently scrapped very late into development, and from what I understand, it's because it wasn't really coming together all that well. And I seem to remember hearing that part of that had to do with the design of the original precinct being a bit too normal and therefore not particularly interesting to explore, but I can't seem to remember where I heard that. So I might be misremembering. Surprisingly though, it's not the first time an almost finished Resident Evil game was scrapped. There was originally a port of the original game on Game Boy Color, which was scrapped because they were unsatisfied with the quality, but come on, it's a Game Boy Color port. It was never going to be the greatest thing ever. And it actually looks pretty competent from what I've seen. But either way, the weirdness of the puzzle design does give this game a tone very much aligned with the first game, which is kind of what you're looking for. I would say the Precinct is just as good if not slightly better than Spencer Mansion. It has the same elegance of design and the same gradual unfolding nature that runs parallel with the mystery that surrounds the game generally. But I would say the design allows for such a constant flow of progress that it almost feels like a ball of yarn that self-unravels. There are admittedly always a few moments in the first game where I have to stop and think what to do next, but not here, and I'm not sure if that has to do with the design, the map indicating which keys correspond to which doors by color coding them, or some other intangible element. If I had to put a finger on it, I think it's because you have a significant portion of the RPD unlocked right from the start, which is very similar to the first game, but there were times in the first game where it could have potentially been a bit too sprawling, leading to you having to do a bit of back and forth. But here I feel like they do a good job at using the keys to dictate the level design by specifically locking off large chunks of the RPD until you've explored everything else that you're able to explore. Meaning you don't have to aimlessly explore the portion of the map locked off by the heart key, you only go there once you have the key. And therefore, you've probably explored near enough the rest of the RPD that you have available to you at that point. So they do a good job at making sure the game feels sprawling, but points you in the right direction by not giving you too much to do, and making sure you only go to certain places when you need to. Essentially, they allow the game to feel sprawling, but you're never overwhelmed by the amount of areas you can search because of how they lock off certain portions of the map. But the game flow is so smooth, you never even notice the fact that it is less sprawling, so it's less sprawling, but in a good way. So yeah, I think the iconic status aside, I think the RPD edges out the Spencer Mansion, but unfortunately, Resident Evil 2 also falls into the same issue the first game had, in that while the main section of the game is great, the other levels really suffer. I would even say the worst levels in RE2 are worse than the worst levels in RE1. The sewer section is practically linear, and that alligator boss fight is beyond pathetic. The factory is such a nothing burger that it shouldn't even count as its own level. I would say the lab is decent enough, but I think it's too big for its own good. There's only like 6 rooms you actually have to go to, but they're all so spread out. So in my mind, you have the RPD slightly above the Spencer Mansion, you have the RE1 lab slightly above the RE2 lab, then the worst sections of RE1 are all better than the worst sections of RE2. Because even at their worst, the lesser levels in RE1 were at least slightly more functional as levels, but it still doesn't matter all that much because the main portion and the progression therein is so good. And that improved sense of progression doesn't just benefit the game from a flow standpoint, but it also helps from a scare standpoint. Because Spencer Mansion could feel a bit static at times. Once you cleared out a hallway, that hallway was clear until the next major plot beat, and the game didn't try to hide that fact. You always knew when new enemies were going to show up in old areas. Meanwhile, the RPD is always evolving, introducing new enemies as well as new obstacles. There's one instance where you have to use a cable to rewire metal shutters to prevent zombies from eventually breaking in, except you never have the ability to lock down all of them because you can never find enough cables. So the game is able to passively communicate that there's something at stake if you don't close the shutters, you can never close all the shutters, and you don't know when the other shoe is gonna drop. Okay, you will if you've played the game before, but until then you won't. So there's this sense of encroaching danger that you have no way to help, but the funniest part is, it's just regular zombies. The type that you would have already killed 100 times by this point. So even while the payoff isn't particularly good, the build-up creates this organic tension in your mind because Resident Evil 2 understands that whatever they put in front of you is never going to be as scary as the things you build up in your own mind. It's brilliant. Kinda like the first game, where you had those POV cutscenes of monsters attacking you. Like, there's one particularly memorable one which is just a shambling creature walking down the stairs while you're coming up from the basement, but it ends up being a vanilla caffeine-free zombie in a somewhat laughable moment, but for those brief moments it's actually tense. Meanwhile, they managed to capture that feeling fairly consistently in this game by allowing what they don't show you to build tension in your mind. It's to the point where you may not even notice that they're not introducing a whole hell of a lot of new enemies, and not particularly frequently either. Like maybe 20 minutes into the game they introduced the first licker. It's pretty well done. I would argue even better than the first zombie was done in the first game, because first you see a glimpse of it through the window. Then as you approach the next corridor, you see a puddle of blood, but the game doesn't give you the ability to look up. Then at that point, the game does this elaborate CGI cutscene to show you the monstrosity hanging from the ceiling. A monstrosity with a big tongue, no eyes, and an exposed brain. Something you can organically learn as they can't see you and can only locate you via sound. So you can get up close to it before it hears you so long as you're walking, at which point you can pretty much run right past it. Either way, it's a fantastic introduction to a brand new recurring enemy, but you don't really get many new enemies for quite a while into the game after that. But the game is so well paced and is so good at making you feel like you're in imminent danger that you may not even notice. Though the game also does get by on cheap jump scares as well, which can be a bit frustrating. There's only a small handful of those in the first game, and they're usually fairly predictable. Meanwhile, this game starts as it means to go on, jump scaring you about 2 minutes into the game when you're in the gun shop. After which, enemies are constantly jumping through windows or breaking through walls or whatever. Like, look at this. A room with a puzzle item and a conspicuous two-way mirror. It's not even a surprise. And I guess if you are the type to enjoy jump scare style horror, that would appeal to you. Personally, I think it's the cheapest and easiest means of horror, and I'm not personally a fan. You can probably tell based on this video, I'm a fan of horror of the unknown, less so than I am the horror of things being unknown and then suddenly not being unknown. As far as the puzzles are concerned, it's mostly the same, mostly just using odd-shaped keys in odd-shaped holes. The challenge just comes down to knowing where to find items and where to use them, and since there aren't a lot of puzzle items to find, it's usually brain-dead simple. At least the first game had a few relatively clever puzzles. I can't honestly remember any particular puzzle off the top of my head here, but I prefer that to being obtuse, so long as the rest of the game is good, and it certainly is. And for what it's worth, if there's one thing these games are really good at, it's the way they're able to indicate things in the environment without it coming across as overly obvious most of the time. Usually they're able to intuitively make something stand out from the rest of the visual noise. So the puzzle aspect of the game continues to be a means to an end, relatively indistinguishable quality-wise from its predecessor, except somehow even more forgettable, and that's okay. Being just as good as the first game goes for a lot of RE2. The combat is basically unchanged. It's still as disadvantageous as it was before. The camera angles still leave the game with a sense of lingering tension as you often hear the shambling horrors nearby but constantly find yourself unable to see them, which goes hand in hand with the superb sound design. The minimalist music is great and really adds to the overall tense atmosphere. Pretty much everything that doesn't have a designated discussion is just as good and doesn't require further comment. But let's get down to brass tacks here. The first game had two protagonists you could choose from. Meanwhile, as I implied with the story discussion, this game does as well. You can choose to play as either Claire Redfield or Leon S. Kennedy. And while I think this aspect of the first game was a bit mixed on account of the weird balancing, I think this aspect of the second game is what elevates it to being possibly my favorite Resident Evil game ever. So first of all, I would say the two playthroughs are pretty much optimally balanced. I don't think either character has any major advantage or disadvantage. They do have a different selection of weapons, but it's nothing crazy. For example, Leon gets a shotgun while Claire gets a bowgun. I think the bowgun is less useful than the shotgun on account of them being functionally the same thing, but also the bowgun fires more rounds per shot. But Claire also gets the grenade launcher, which Leon doesn't get. Meanwhile, Leon gets a magnum. So it's this nice spread where Claire arguably gets the worst weapon in the game, but also arguably the best. Meanwhile, Leon gets a nice consistent functional arsenal, so the experience is relatively balanced while still being somewhat distinct experiences. Which is fortunate because the game all but tells you to play through the game, or at least a version of the game, as both characters. You see, unlike the first game where each playthrough is essentially its own timeline, neither of which are consistent with the rest of the games, as none of the endings show every character that canonically gets away getting away. This is a case where it's a bit more complicated. So here's what's up. On your first playthrough, you will play what they refer to as the A campaign. And after that, you're given the option to play through the game again as the other character in what's referred to as the B campaign. Both these campaigns are parallel to each other and mostly work as parallel stories. There are some things that don't make much sense, like how you never seem to run into the other character during gameplay, or how you have to constantly do the same puzzles and open the same doors. So unless there's a secret cabal of ninjas running around resetting everything, that doesn't make much sense. Kinda reminds me of an old coworker's favorite joke. How if you ever have something you can't explain, just say ninjas. And if anybody questions it, you respond with, they're just that good. I miss that guy. But anyways, I'd say the two parallel stories thing sort of falls apart on the grander inspection, but if you give it some leeway, it works well enough. I mean, it's not like the RE2 remake, which actively contradicts itself with the A and B stories. Great game, but that was stupid. But this way, this means you get a somewhat unique experience pretty much back to back, with different puzzles, different story elements, different progression, different weapons, and so on. It uses its own premise to double up on gameplay, and that's awesome. Plus, there are certain ways you can affect the other campaign. It's only a few contextual moments, most notably this weapons locker where you can grab a pouch which will give you 2 extra item slots and or a submachine gun. If you grab one or the other in one campaign, you can't get it in the other campaign. In my case, I accidentally forgot to get this on my A campaign, so I was able to double up on my B campaign. But still, it's a neat little idea. There's even some unique aspects to the game if you do it in reverse. Like, Claire A is different in certain ways to Claire B, and Leon A is different in certain ways from Leon B. And funnily, unlike the first game, where neither playthrough is necessarily canon, this is a case where there actually is a canon playthrough. In Claire A, Leon B, Sherry gets infected by William, and this doesn't happen in the other combination. And in later games, Sherry is shown to still have a bit of the infection in her. Without this, I don't think we'd know which combination is canon. But either way, it's good because I prefer this version. Mostly because after her death fake-out, Ada gives you the game-winning item, and it just doesn't hit as hard if it's not Leon.
Here, use this!
Ada, is that you? Ada!
Here, use this!
Who are you?
That's a good question.
That said, there is a primary distinction between the A campaign and B campaign. And that is the big bad. In the A campaign, the big villain in both cases is William Birkin. But of course, unlike what the RE2 remake would have you believe, you can't defeat the same villain in both playthroughs, so they need to have a separate distinct villain in the B campaign, so step right up the RE2 Tyrant, officially referred to as T00, not Mr. X. You may think that was a remake thing, but something I didn't find out until doing research for this video, he's never officially been referred to as Mr. X in universe. That's entirely fanon, and that's kind of awesome. The idea that something can be so ubiquitous that nobody even notices that it's never been official. Now, I don't know why the Tyrant is specifically targeting our player characters. I guess in theory he's going after whatever survivors he can find. But it continues to build into this thing about neither Claire nor Leon feeling particularly involved in the story. Of course, the idea of the Tyrant is you want to use him to make the B campaign harder. That makes sense. You just played through the game, you're going to be playing through it again, it should be more difficult in theory. But the phrase "in theory" is the operative phrase there, because my god, he is the most hilarious attempt at a super weapon in the history of Resident Evil. I was told before playing the game that his primary attack was one of the slowest attacks in history, and that's barely an exaggeration. He hits you with a quick jab, which barely does any damage, which sets up an overhead strike that takes a solid 2 or so seconds to connect. Usually by the time the attack finishes, I will have gone through 2 or 3 camera angle changes. It's hilarious. Honestly, I don't think there's ever been a more significant glow-up in the history of gaming in regards to enemy threat than the glow-up of the Tyrant between this and the remake. Aside from being ineffectual, he also rarely shows up. Before the final boss, he shows up like 4 or 5 times maybe, and he doesn't follow you through more than a small handful of room transitions. It's kind of embarrassing if I'm being honest. Though technically the Tyrant isn't the final boss of the B campaign, technically it's actually William Birkin in his final form, a giant blob. It's kinda hilarious in a cosmic sort of way how this dude somehow managed to survive everything up to this point and only died when the train he was on self-destructed. Like, do the super monsters in this series ever die? At least before the facilities they're in explode? I guess I'm just lucky I was a bit stingy and accidentally saved my magnum bullets for this. And that was Resident Evil 2. I'm not sure if this is a normie take, but I think this might be the best Resident Evil game ever made. Certainly the best fixed camera Resident Evil game in my opinion. If it had a more effective Tyrant and was able to maintain its momentum during the back half of the game, it might have ended up being in my top 10 favorite games of all time. It had the opportunity to work out the kinks and fix less optimal game design from the first game, while still feeling fresh and not feeling the need to branch out and try new ideas in an attempt to keep the game fresh. On a related note, the final game in this trilogy is of course Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3, otherwise known as Nemesis, is a bit of a difficult one to talk about because I do think it's definitively the lesser of the original trilogy, but I also think it's one of those games that gets better on repeat playthroughs. Unlike the first two games, which are pretty much as good as they're ever gonna get on the first playthrough. In fact, I think RE1 might even get slightly worse on a second playthrough. And while I fully believe a game should be good the first time, there's no doubt in my mind that this is a game which I feel far more positively towards on repeat playthroughs. The plot this time around takes place before, during, and after the plot of Resident Evil 2 depending on which part. This game takes the base that RE2 established and continues to expand it. RE2 took a very small, intimate story and made it far bigger by introducing the Outbreak, but in that case, you're still largely only seeing the Outbreak through the eyes of either Claire or Leon, whereas in this case, they increased the scope even more by showing the entire city being taken over by zombies from the perspective of an entire army's worth of people, showcasing just how tough the enemy threat is, and how even the most highly trained personnel around can't necessarily stand up to the threat. Really just shows you how insurmountable the threat is and why the only course of action left is to go the nuclear option. Quite literally. With that said, the actual plot of the game is somewhat vapid. The entire thing is centered around Jill Valentine. After her and Chris's futile attempts to bring to light all the things that Umbrella had done, it was too little too late, and nothing could be done to bring them to justice. But justice is low on the priorities list as soon as the outbreak begins. So now with no way to expose Umbrella and with her home being destroyed, all Jill can do is attempt to escape. Why she waited until the city was taken over by zombies before escaping is a mystery to me. Same thing goes for why she's dressed like she's going to the club and not going out in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, but never mind. And that is the extent of the plot at first. You have to escape. And you do so with the help of the remaining members of an Umbrella mercenary team led by this guy Nikolai, who is somehow even more of an obvious villain than Albert Wesker in the first game. Meanwhile, your main support character is this guy whose name is a punchline to one of my favorite terrible jokes. What do you call a Mexican who's misplaced his car? Carlos. That's so bad. From what I understand, this game was originally supposed to be a smaller, more action-based spin-off akin to Resident Evil Survivor or Dead Aim, but eventually it was expanded into a full game and given the full numbered title treatment in order for Capcom to fulfill their contractual obligations to Sony. It was being made alongside RE2 and shares a game engine, certain assets, and even entire locations. So between that and the fact that the story feels so inconsequential for most of it, really does pay credence to it not having originally been a mainline title. I mean, Christ, the two major surviving characters in this game, Carlos and Nikolai, I don't think ever show up as major characters ever again. I mean, this is a series that brought back Sherry, 12-year-old who looks 5, Birkin, as a playable character, but these two people? They never make a significant splash ever again. Also, yes, Nikolai does canonically survive. I was surprised by that. Plus, you also have to consider the fact that there's only one campaign in the game. Sure, that would be the norm going forward, but when comparing all three of these games in a vacuum, you can't help but feel that RE3 is conspicuous in that it feels smaller because of this. Had this game not ended with, spoiler alert, Raccoon City being nuked, I don't think there would be anything significant enough about this game to warrant it being a numbered entry. But don't take this to assume I don't like the game. Despite the criticisms I can levy at it, I think Resident Evil 3 overall is only slightly below the first game in terms of quality, to the point I would probably rank them both as B-tier entries. The big difference this time around is that unlike the previous games, which were set in relatively small, intimate environments, this is set in the streets of Raccoon City. It's still laid out in the same way as previous games, so even though you're in the streets, the only way to get around is via doors that take you to other streets. I guess Umbrella was also in charge of civic planning. It's not an issue with the game, but it does seem a bit weird that the city is still largely designed like Spencer Mansion. Either way, that's not the reason why I felt a bit cold on this game during my first playthrough, but it is sort of connected. The reason why I felt a bit poorly disposed towards this game initially had to do with two issues: the difficulty and the level design. Let's talk about the level design first. The level design in the first couple of games were among the best aspects of the game because they were incredibly tightly designed. One of the big things that really helped the design of Spencer Mansion or the RPD is verticality. You had multiple floors in the same building that were easily accessed from multiple areas, meaning you could cut down on travel time if you knew the best routes. A significant portion of this game, perhaps even the majority, takes place in the streets of Raccoon City where you have to get some items together to fix a cable car, but since the portion of Raccoon City you're traveling in is mostly flat, there's no shortcuts. Usually there's only one way to get from point A to point B, and the flat design means that the same surface area that was in the previous games is now spread out significantly, meaning that traveling the same relative surface area now takes longer. This wouldn't be an issue necessarily, but you have to travel significant distances to do much of anything. There are times when you have to go to uptown to downtown and then back again, which means traveling through the exact same areas over and over, which can take a while. That's why this game is less enjoyable on a first playthrough, because until you figure out what you need to do with each item and what the optimal routes are, the travel time can make the game very obnoxious. With that said, I specifically made sure to play through the game a second time before writing my thoughts down because I wanted to be fair and give my thoughts once I was already familiar with the game. Despite liking the first two games on their first playthroughs, I still played them multiple times before this video, enough to be considered a relative expert. And that can't be said about Nemesis, and in the object of fairness, my hunch was correct. I cut my time down significantly, and once I understood what each particular area required of me, I found that I was having a much better time and everything flowed much more smoothly with a minimum amount of backtracking. But still, I get that this is a natural escalation of scale, but this era of the series was at its best when there was a constant forward march of progress. And when you take that away by increasing the scale to this degree, it does create a lot of dead air. By the time you get to the clock tower, it already feels like the game has exceeded the length of the average Resident Evil game, at least in this era. But at that point, you still have 4 major areas you have to go through. You have to play the clock tower, you have to play as Carlos getting the vaccine, you have to play through the park section, then you have to play through the dead lab section. But side by side, the lengths are actually quite comparable. I just think the less compelling progression and exploration makes the game feel more drawn out than it actually is. That said though, once you get past the section in Raccoon City proper, I think the 4 levels after that are actually quite a bit better than the later levels in the first 2 games. The worst of it is probably the hospital, as there's only like 10 rooms and very few, if any, good puzzles. But the clock tower is exactly the type of level I look for in these games, the park is elaborate with some fun puzzles and a good boss fight, and the same goes for the dead lab at the end. It's just the first section that gets a bit awkward, and that's a shame because that's the lion's share of the game. The design simply lacks the tightness and cohesion of the first 2 games, and the second issue is the difficulty. This game is not friendly to beginners whatsoever. The level design sort of works hand in hand with that, because having to go through the more drawn-out environments means you're forced to encounter more enemies right from the word go, and generally speaking, the average environment has more enemies per square inch than the previous games by default. But ammo is still relatively scarce, meaning that I felt the game turned the dial from compelling resource management to slightly obnoxious resource management, and trying to work your way through these environments while preserving ammo is torturous at times. I would have loved to try this game on easy mode the first time to get to grips with it, but unfortunately, easy mode in this game is outright insulting, giving you 3 first aid sprays and an assault rifle right at the beginning on top of the usual advantages like enemies being weaker and pickups being more generous. That's not easy mode, that's baby mode. I would have loved a mode that was slightly more forgiving to first-timers but not outright insulting to play, so I decided to power through hard mode just for my own pride's sake. Once again though, not much of an issue once you know what the game expects of you. But it still basically means that the initial impressions aren't indicative of the game's overall quality, and I can't help but hold that against the game. Which is a shame because I feel like RE3 has some really cool ideas that could have very well elevated it to being the best of the 3. First of all is the eponymous feature, Nemesis. You see, in an effort to try and cover up everything they had done, Umbrella unleashed a brand new tyrant into the streets to take out the Stars by any means necessary. Specifically the Stars, hence why Stars is the only thing it can say. Stars. Which is not to say that Buddy Boy won't also take out anybody else in its way, but he's only actively hunting the Stars, and he ends up being your main obstacle in your attempts to leave the city. I have a feeling that Nemesis was sort of an overreaction to the Tyrant from the second game. Instead of only showing up once in a while and instead of being completely ineffective, Nemesis is absolutely relentless. He shows up pretty much every 5 minutes, his attacks are devastating and hard to dodge, he even has a rocket launcher at one point, and once he shows up in a specific area, he will chase you down until the next story beat. Sometimes he will just be milling about, but other times he will be chasing you from section to section, taking that slow-paced methodical action horror concept and turning it into a panicky and desperate flight for survival. I say flight because he's seemingly invincible, so to most players, fleeing is the only option. Here's the twist though, you can fight him if you want. He's not invincible, he just takes a lot of punishment. Especially early into the game before you have any decent weapons, he is a menace to beat. With that said though, there are 7 different times where he shows up and it's considered a different sequence, and during each of those sequences you have the option to fight him to get a new reward. Better weapons, first aid containers, the works. Basically meaning the more you defeat him, the easier the game gets. I remember at one point hearing that every time you defeat Nemesis he has less health during the next encounter, which is apparently not true. I'd say his effectiveness in the scare department does start to wane as the game goes on account of it mostly being the same thing over and over. He'll show up to jump scare you and you'll either fight or flee until he stops following you. But I would say he never loses his effectiveness as a means to jumpstart gameplay, because it ensures you can never get complacent, you can never assume that you're safe, and it kicks the gameplay from 0 to 100 in a second. So I would say he's everything that the previous Tyrants weren't in the best way possible. And the weapons you get for defeating him are some of the best weapons in the game, like a pistol that fires at double speed and has a much higher critical hit chance. Plus, even when Nemesis isn't there, the game still does a good job at making sure you're on your toes by the way the environments evolve. The city feels like a dynamic area that's constantly changing as the outbreak is getting worse and worse. And there are a couple of other features that really help this game along, such as how with the elevated focus on combat, you required some more defensive capabilities on account of the previous standard for combat being pretty basic. In this case, they introduced what they call a dodge mechanic, but it's more like a parry. If you hit the aim button or the fire button if you're already aiming right before an enemy attacks you, you will dodge out of the way. It also makes fighting Nemesis far more viable, as it means you don't have to resort to the run and shoot method all the time. With that said though, depending on the circumstances, some of his attacks will still hit you even if you dodge. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but the dodge at least helps. In fact, during one of my playthroughs, I made it a point to master the dodge mechanic and fight Nemesis every time it would have resulted in me getting an item, which means a lot of dying and reloading again, etc. Though there are times where you have the ability to get the item without actually having to fight him. You see, this game has multiple branching paths where you can choose a specific action. Usually it doesn't amount to anything past that specific gameplay sequence, but it does make for some neat optional cutscenes. Die zombies die. However, specifically, there are a couple of times where you can wound Nemesis in such a way that he drops the item you can only get for defeating him in combat. And I don't think there's any drawback for doing that. I think I remember trying to flee him in the restaurant instead of blowing up the restaurant, and I remember in the immediate aftermath it took a while longer for him to show up after, but I think that might have just been a coincidence. Still, it's a cool and unique feature nonetheless. A feature that really sets this game apart from the rest of the series, and the other unique feature in this game is ammo crafting. One of the earliest examples of this, and something that was actually brought back in recent games. You can mix and match gunpowder types to give you different types of ammo. You already get a base level of ammo for all your weapons, but this gives you the chance to tailor your playstyle to your favorite weapons. Personally, I like me some grenade launcher, and in that case you can simply add gunpowder A and B together to make C, which gives you 10 standard grenade launcher ammo. But if you add more to it, you can change what kind of grenade launcher ammo you get. Fire ammo is probably your best bang for your buck, but depending on your playstyle, there are a lot of options. I would even say the puzzles are slightly more interesting than the previous games. Keyword there is slightly. Most of them are still fairly brainless, but there are a few that at least require you to make an observation, like that 3-stone puzzle where you have to balance the 3 stones in order to get the middle clock to midnight. How about that substation switch puzzle where you have to use math calculations to get the correct voltage to open up 2 separate doors? How about that glorified sliding tile puzzle in the fountain? Once again, things that don't require much thought, but at least require more thought than the 0 thought that was required previously. Though then there's that one puzzle with the weighted switch where you have 4 options of where to put it. Apparently you're supposed to get a clue of the arrangement from another room, but I didn't know that, so I just brute forced the puzzle. And with the improved combat comes improved boss fights. The 2 that spring to mind would be the giant worm fight where you have to dodge it coming out of the ground and then attack it, and in some playthroughs you have to finish it off by electrocuting it. That's cool. Only sometimes though, as the game has a tendency of randomizing certain elements from time to time. Then you have what is effectively the final boss against Nemesis. You have to use environmental acid valves to melt him, which is tough at first, but man is it satisfying to lure him into a specific area and melt his ass. Plus, this is also under a time limit, which just makes it all the more suspenseful. Technically, the real final boss is Nemesis in its weird blob-like final form. In that case, you have to fire at it a couple of times with this giant, thing, whatever it is. Also, you have the option of either letting it live or finishing it off, and I would like to see what kind of troglodyte would leave this thing alive. So all in all, the game has improved combat, relatively improved puzzles, environmental evolution, a far more effective super weapon, a better second half, and some other fun ideas that really help it along. But between the less than stellar level design in the first half of the game, the somewhat unforgiving nature of the game for first-timers, and the fact the game feels relatively inconsequential means that what could have easily been the best in the trilogy ends up being worse than deserved. I would still rank it roughly alongside the first game, and which one I like better will pretty much change from day to day depending on my mood, though I usually put it slightly below. It reaches higher highs, but the lesser aspects are definitely more noticeable. It was just a small leap from being one of the GOATs. Even still, I think all these games are great in spite of their jank and their archaic design. One might even say that the archaic design adds to the experience in the sense that you don't really get many games like this anymore because most games these days have been refined to the point of being quite similar. It's not just the first game that's better than the sum of its parts. All 3 of these games shouldn't work given modern design standards when looking at them, but they are really enjoyable games that are simple and I could come back to them anytime. But aside from being fun games in their own right despite their age, these games are also worth preserving because all games are worth preserving. Whatever attitude executives have, I believe games are art. A friend of mine made the point recently, though he may have heard it from somewhere else, that video games kind of fall into the nether realm between art and technology. Technology is something that should be replaced every now and again. For sure, I need to upgrade my graphics card at some point. And some might see this as the case for video games as well, because they are so reliant on technology and that technology is ever evolving. So it's easy to see old games as replaceable, but I think that's bullshit. Just because games could be considered in the same vein as technology, and even if you don't personally see games as art, that doesn't mean that games don't at least contain art. That doesn't mean that people didn't work themselves half to death to make a fun and memorable product with the tools they had available. And that's why I think Capcom and their attitude towards their old games, and their surprise over the fact that people would ever have any sort of reverence for their old games, can eat a bag of dicks. They believe their old work is replaceable because they view them as products. I view them as worthwhile artistic endeavors. And that's why it's up to us, the fans, the people on the ground, to fight to preserve these old games in whatever way we can. Because if we don't, you can bet your ass that the executives for these big companies won't. This is also why, and allow me to get on my soapbox, I also get hung up on the fact that some YouTubers will use footage of remakes instead of the original versions when discussing said games. For example, if you're discussing the Spyro PS1 trilogy but you're using footage of the Reignited trilogy, that's inherently backwards to me because for one thing, it passively erases the original versions from our collective consciousness, and second of all, it's a dishonest discussion. You can't discuss all the innovations that the original Spyro games made if you're not talking about the version where those innovations happened. If you want to discuss the remake, discuss the remake, but I think it's damaging to treat an original version and a remake as interchangeable when they're not. History is not replaceable, and that's the final word. Actually, these are. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.